Okie dokie. So this is kind of the last little catch-up meeting before we get together this weekend. Just to remind everybody, we will be meeting at Melink Solar, and that's located at, I should have written down the address. It's in Milford, Hidden River Parkway, I think, or maybe something like that. It's pretty easy to get into if you use your Google maps or whatever. When you turn into the office complex, it's like an industrial / office complex, and Melink owns most of it. You'll turn down, you'll go down this bit of a windy road. You'll see there's a very large wind turbine right there. So head for that wind turbine, because we're in the building. As you pull up, it's on the left-hand side of that wind turbine, and there's a great big solar canopy there. So just park under that solar canopy and you're at the right building. We'll have the place to ourselves. That, it's over the weekend, so they're not there. So just come on up. There's plenty of parking. There's charging stations. If you've got an electric vehicle, you can charge up your vehicle. It's a pretty slick place. It's really nice. And we could maybe even do a little walk around. You'll see some of the systems. It's actually 5130 instead of 40, but
okay.
There are two buildings right next to each other. So one of them is like their corporate offices and the other one is their solar place. So we should be able to rummage through the warehouse as well. You can see all their piles of solar panels and their racking and, all of those kind of things. If you haven't actually seen physically the full-size stuff, it's kind of an interesting place to be. Yep.
So, hey Jay, I have some questions about that day, that weekend, next weekend.
Sure.
So, I mean, can you like run me through real quick? Like, so we get there, we do a lab, go through things hands-on, and then the next day or that same day we're going to take the test?
Yeah, no, on Saturday, we'll begin right at about 8:30, 9 o'clock. Hopefully people will begin arriving 8:30ish, just so we can be fully engaged by 9 o'clock. It will be a full day of labs. So we'll spend all day Saturday just going through the various labs that are required. I'll go ahead and we'll order, I don't know, like Chipotle or something, have Uber meals or whatever, bring it in. So we won't leave for lunch. I'll have coffee and stuff, but if you need something else, bring it yourself other than lunch and some coffee. We'll probably be done 4:30, 5. It really depends on how long the group takes to get through all of the various labs, but it will be on Saturday, a full day of the hands-on labs. Then Sunday morning, we'll meet in the same place, same room, everything, about 9 o'clock. We'll do the review. We'll walk through all the chapter questions, all the reviews, maybe do a couple of math questions if we can. That seems to be where people are most confused or concerned, is to walk through some of the, how do you size an array? How do you do a string calculation? Maximum, minimums, voltage drop calculations, things like that. Once everybody feels like you're prepared, then we'll break for lunch again. And then we'll take the test. Then as soon as the test is over, y'all can scatter to the winds.
Or is it really like a formal kind of test, or is it something you're grading and then?
No, it's formal. The written exam is formal. The hands-on is basically, I will attest to the fact that you did it. There's no, you screwed it up and now you failed kind of thing. We'll just keep working the hands-on till everybody feels comfortable. And it's really more an experiential thing rather than you didn't strip the wire exactly properly, or something like that. It's just, they want to know that you in fact did this, were exposed to it. But you may have screwed it up. Well, that's not the issue. The issue is, did you do it? And then I attest to the fact that you did. The written exam is a very formal exam, right? It comes from ETA. We'll go through the whole process. I'll talk to you about what I'm allowed to answer, what I'm not allowed to answer. You'll have one of those Scantron type score sheets, and you don't write in the exam booklets. There's 75 questions. They're all multiple choice, very similar in format to how the end of the chapter questions are. They're not going to be the exact questions, but I feel like if you can answer the end of the chapter questions, you should be able to answer all the questions on the test.
Yeah, the only thing I have issues with, I can answer most of the questions just off the top of my head, but it's like the formula questions that, and all the acronyms that just, I have so many acronyms that just swim around in your head. That's like,
Sure.
One was which now, and what does what, and
Yeah. It's like learning a new language, it's
Jay, do you know right then and there if you pass or not?
No, you won't know, because I then package up all of those and ship them off to Indianapolis. They grade them, and then you'll know within a week, how you did. Now, you do have the option to retake the exam at no charge one time, but you've got to wait 30 days before you can retake the exam. So, but the exam is 75 questions, and you've got to get a 75%. It's a pass fail. So if you get them all right, or if you miss 18, you still passed. If you miss 19, you didn't pass. So I hesitate to say it's not that hard, because nothing's that hard if you know the answer. But, it's not designed to be tricky. It's not designed to try and make you fail. It's designed to just simply test a entry-level, basic level of knowledge about photovoltaics. So I feel like if you've gone through the chapters, if you've reviewed the end of the chapter questions, and you feel comfortable with it, you should do fine.
would you say that all the questions that are in the test are nested somewhere in the chapter review questions?
Yes. There's nothing that you will be exposed to that you weren't exposed to in the textbook and asked about in the end of the chapter questions. So it's a pretty, the textbook is much more comprehensive. You're getting a lot of stuff in the textbook that will not be on the exam, but you will not get anything on the exam that's not in the textbook or in the end of the chapter things.
I have one more question too, is I find that the PowerPoint, the slides, I have a hard time reading and retaining. So I mainly watch and listen to all the slides, the Google slides that you have set up. And that's how I've been going through the chapters instead of reading. And I was wondering how long is that account open for me to just review and say, 2 months down the line when I'm building my solar system, I could go back and, look at that. How long is that open?
I have been leaving it open at least a year. So it will be open at least a year. It may be longer. It just depends when I start to build up enough of a database that it becomes problematic. It doesn't cause me any issues to leave the account open.
Okay.
But I might find sometime in the future, I've got to start paring that down. But for right now, I'll leave it for at least a year and maybe even beyond, which might be very advantageous to you because I'm revising those slides all the time. So, by the time I shut it down, you may have a completely different course up there. So
I was just curious, like if you ever would allow, a former student to just, have access. If I just email you and say, hey, Jay, can you just leave my account open a little more? I'd like to be able to just continue to review it.
Not a problem. Cool. And you may want to even go back, because even since you've started this course, I've gone back through the first couple of chapters and I'm starting to incorporate some animation into it. And so that's my newest little gadget there. Some of them are, some slides lend themselves to that, like when you're drawing out an IV curve and you want to see where all the different points are. It's a little easier to be animated rather than me narrating, say, up in the bottom, in the bottom right-hand corner is this, and in the upper left-hand corner is that. You can just have it appear, as it's happening. Yeah, Paul, I see your hands up there. Did you?
Yeah, so I had the same question on the slide decks, but the paper that we're going to be using for scratch paper, is that something we bring, or you're going to have paper there? And then the calculator, is that a separate calculator that we bring, or can we use our phones for the calculator?
You can't use your phone, and I will have little cheapy calculators, but if you've got your own little calculator that you like, a lot of people have those Texas Instruments or whatever, those are okay. What they don't want is something that you can use that's got memory, that you can do searches. So your phone is kind of is a no-go, but I'll have calculators, I'll have pencils, I'll have paper. You can bring whatever you want, but I'll try and make sure that I supply if you didn't have it.
Okay.
And one of the nice things, or one of the reasons I like to use the paper for the exam, because they do have it set up, we could do it on computer terminals, but I found that the technology can sometimes get in the way, and it's just better to say, okay, this is one less thing I have to worry about, rather than my system crashing or my internet connection going down or something like that. I've just got a piece of paper and a pencil, and I can just focus on the test. So that's worked out much better, I think, over time. You'll have 2 hours for the exam from the time we begin it. If there is a medical reason why you need more time, let me know ahead of time, and we'll accommodate that. But assuming there is none, then we'll just simply, I'll call time at the end of the 2 hours. Most people are done in significantly less time than that. Usually it's maybe an hour. You'll see about half the group is done at about an hour. There's always somebody in the group who's very methodical and will take the entire full 2 hours. And I'll be going, hey, you've got 10 minutes left. And the person will go, yeah, I'm just checking everything over, for the 4th time or whatever. And that's good. You don't get any points for finishing first, So, and I'm, like I said, you can miss up to 18 questions. I mean, that's pretty generous as far as out of 75. Hopefully you guys, nobody's going to miss any. You shouldn't. So, you all know, you know it all. So, let me see. Oh, some of the questions I'm allowed to answer. Sometimes if English is not a first language, I'll often get questions like, what is meant by an attic, or what's a truss, something like that. Well, that's not the point of the question. So I can explain what that means. But if somebody says, what do you mean by voltage drop? I'm going to go, no, can't answer that. That's all on you. So, and if I do answer the question, or if I can answer the question, I'll repeat the question to everybody taking the test and then tell the answer to the group. So everybody gets the same information. So then your certification is valid for 4 years. You are required to do 6 hours of continuing education every year. It doesn't all have to be 6 hours 1 year, 6 hours the next. It's just 24 hours over the 4-year period in order to renew it. I have a lot of training programs on our website. If you look down, all of those Solar Noon Tuesday sessions that Ed, you've been going to, and I don't know if anybody else has been on those, but those all qualify for half an hour of continuing education. So you could just do 12 of those and get your 6 hours in play and at no cost. I've got them all posted and on our website. You can just finish it. It'll kick out a certificate. I have those things set up so they automatically send the certificate to ETA. So they'll receive it, put it in your file so that at the end of the year, you don't even have to keep track of that stuff. You just say, hey, you should have certificates on file for my continuing education. So trying to make it simple that way. And there's a $25 a year fee to maintain your certification, which is pretty, I mean, it's dirt cheap. And that gives you membership to ETA, which you'll receive their newsletter, and you'll get a wallet card that shows you're certified. You'll get a certificate that you can frame somewhere and put on your refrigerator, whatever you do with these things. But the wallet card's helpful because sometimes, you know, an inspector might come on the job. If you're in a jurisdiction that requires certification, you'll have that as proof of certification. So you can just, it's sort of like an OSHA 10 card or something like that. So anyway, that's going to be there. We may also decide on Sunday, I'll leave it up to the group. You might decide, let's start a little bit earlier. You know, let's start at 8 instead of 9. That way we're done an hour earlier. You know, so I'll just leave that all up to you. Because some people may have flights to catch or a long drive home or something like that. So we'll be kind of loosey-goosey, hopefully. And any other questions about the logistics of it?
After the test, Jay, do you review some of the questions, or after we close out, can we go over some of the questions if we had questions on it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, that's usually done informally, you know, one-on-one. You
Right.
know, a lot of times students will come up and say, here, I've handed you my answers. I'm not going to change anything, but what was, you know,
Yeah,
what do you
right.
call this? Or how do you do that? Or did I guess right? Or whatever. And all, you know, it's usually a case of they answered it correctly first and then they changed it to a wrong answer. That's 9 times out of 10 what happens. You know, they overthink it, and usually go with your gut. First impressions are often the right impressions. As I said, nothing is designed to trick you, and they also will not have any negative questions. You'll notice a lot of my questions in the review are negatives. And I try and do that only because I often want to give you 3 correct answers. You know, it's like using it as training with 1 incorrect, where they'll only ask for what is the correct one, you know. So to me, that's a little easier. And certainly the negatives could sometimes be confusing, especially if you get into a double negative, like
Yeah,
which of the following is not the case, and then there's a negative in the answer, you know, then you're all
Yeah.
quite, yeah, then you're crazy.
Yeah,
So,
so I'll be honest, sometimes your questions drive me crazy.
yeah. Well, sometimes they're designed to drive you crazy.
I'll start thinking about, and I remember one of the chapter reviews or one of the labs, there was like 4 or 5 in a row. I'm just like, I can't, my mind is not even working anymore.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I try and do especially in the math questions, is every single answer is one that you can get to if you do the equation
Formula
wrong,
wrong.
you know. So I try and anticipate how you might how you might do it wrong, and then give you the answer that you will get if you do it the wrong way. So you can't just keep juggling numbers till you get one that matches one of the answers, and then you go, oh, that must be right because I got that answer. So, you know, a good example might be if you're trying to figure out what's the amp rating for a PV output circuit, and it gives you a certain number of source circuits. You know, those are the wires that go from the panels to the combiner box. And one of the answers might be just taking all of the source circuit amperage and then multiplying times the number of source circuits to get the output circuit. Except then you've forgotten to multiply times 1.25 for the NEC safety, and then 1.25 for the solar variability. So I'll give you an answer that multiplies 1 time times 1.25, one, you know, the right answer that's got it 2 times, and then one that forgets to multiply it times the number of source circuits, things like that. So hopefully these terms are now starting to make sense when I talk about a source circuit, which is the one that goes from the panel to the combiner box or junction box. Then there's the PV output circuit that goes from the combiner box to the DC disconnect. then the inverter input circuit that goes from the DC disconnect to the inverter, and then the inverter output circuit, which goes from the inverter to the load. So, you know, and the reason why that's terminology you got to remember is we often make those references. So you'll see in the literature, for instance, it says, incorporate a DC disconnect in the PV output circuit. Well, if you didn't know what that was, you wouldn't know, you know, I mean, you wouldn't know what they're talking about. So that's why some of this terminology may seem nitpicking, but it is important because you need to just make reference to it. So, all right, was there anything in the material that was causing anybody any grief? Yeah, Paul, your hand up.
Not necessarily grief, but a clarification. I went back to page 99. There was a discussion on the panel junction box, and the discussion talks about the blocking diode to prevent reverse current. And then you look at the diagram, figure 5.4, and figure 5.4 is talking about bypass diode. And so is the blocking diode and the bypass diode the same thing? Because I didn't see any description on the bypass diode.
Yeah,
that's pointed out in the diagram.
Yeah, the bypass diode is typically the one that's in the junction box of the panel. You know, that little box that's on the back of the panel is the bypass diode. That's where those things are built in. The blocking diode in most systems today are going to be incorporated in the either the charge controller or in the inverter. They're going to keep power from flowing backwards. So you can sometimes get junction boxes, not the junction box, and this gets a little confusing because they refer to two different pieces of equipment as junction boxes. There's a junction box on the back of the panel, and then there's a junction box where you connect the strings from the array and continue on to the DC disconnects, you know, like a combiner box or a junction box. So sometimes you'll have a blocking diode in there. So I'm not looking at the book itself, but I think the picture that you see of a diode, that's going to be a bypass diode. So that's built into the array or into the panel. The blocking diode is usually built into the equipment, whether it's the charge controller or the inverter, that just keeps power from flowing backwards.
Okay, and then the purpose of the bypass diode, I'm missing that.
Yeah, the bypass diode is a way to minimize the effect of shading or damage in a solar panel. So for instance, if you've got a 60 cell panel, you could hook all 60 cells together in a string, but then whatever happens to one of those cells affects all 60 cells. So a little bit of shading, let's say a leaf falls on that panel and blocks one of the cells, all of the cells stop producing electricity. Whatever the least of them does affects them all. So in order to minimize that, they've put in these little bypass diodes. So they've essentially created 3 strings of 20 cells. So now if a leaf falls on that panel, it only affects 20 of the cells, not 60 of them. And it bypasses that string of cells that's affected. So, you know, ideally they'd put a bypass diode on every single cell, but each bypass diode puts a bit of resistance into the system. So they'd end up basically not producing power because you'd be adding so much resistance. So they've settled usually on 3 bypass diodes in a panel just to isolate those strings.
Okay, I'll have to go back and look for the section on bypass diode. It was just confusing because the bypass diode pictures is right next to the blocking diodes description.
Right. Well,
the next question, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. What you could do is I've just added a brand new video. It's a good video in the online portion. So if you go back into, I think it's chapter 2, the section on other factors, there's a lot more information there now about bypass diodes, you know, than there was.
And then on page 113, it was talking about the GCFI, but then it started talking about GFPE. And so can you describe the difference between the GCFI and the GFPE? And that was
Oh,
on page 113.
yeah, I don't know. I might have to look at that because these are all ground fault protection devices. Let's see, I don't have the book in front of me, but one of them, ground fault, what is the acronym? Ground fault
GFPE. And then, so you got figure
protection
516, which is a
equipment.
GFCI.
Yeah,
And then you've got 517, which is a GFPE.
yeah, yeah. That's protection equipment versus what, current interrupter,
Ground fault circuit interrupter.
circuit interrupter. Yeah, and I think is
Ground
the
fault
circuit
protection
interrupter
equipment.
the one that's the outlet? I'm just trying to go by
Yes.
memory. Yeah, and
Mhm.
that's something that you typically put, along anywhere that there's water present. The protection equipment, I think, is a broader class. I guess the relevant part of that, and sorry, I don't have it at top of mind, but the relevant part is that the codes, the UL 1741 now requires that ground fault protection be built into every single inverter. And so if current is present in the ground system, the system is designed to immediately shut down, and then it gives you an indication that there is a ground fault, and you cannot then generate any current until that ground fault has been addressed. So from your perspective there, it's just important to know that ground fault protection is built into all inverters. And that's one of the reasons why we no longer have what they refer to as solidly grounded systems. Because in the old days, just like with a service panel, if you look in your service panel, the neutral gets connected to the same bus bar, or the two bus bars are linked, as the ground. That is a solid connection. The neutral is the grounded conductor, and it's solidly connected to the ground. But in a solar system, because the inverter, the ground is connected through ground fault protection. So the grounded conductor, which in this case is going to be the negative, is not physically connected to the ground. It's functionally connected, but it's not physically, because there is a ground fault detection device in between the two. That comes into play because of the way that the NEC is written. Is color coding is based on whether it is a grounded conductor or a ungrounded conductor. And because it's no longer physically connected to the ground, the NEC said it's not really considered a grounded conductor anymore. So the color coding goes out the window.
Now I'm confused.
Yeah, okay. Well, color coding for grounded conductors
Not
is
know
diff-
that green.
No. This gets confusing, because now you're talking about a equipment ground wire versus a grounded conductor. And so let's go to AC electricity for a second. Usually when you're pulling AC electricity, if you've got 120, just Romex cable, you've got an equipment grounding conductor, which is going to be bare copper wire, or it might be green. Then you've got a white wire, which we refer to as the neutral, and then the hot, which is the black. Well, as far as the NEC is concerned, they don't use those terms. They use the equipment grounding conductor, which is the bare copper, the grounded conductor, because the neutral gets connected to the ground in your service panel, and the ungrounded conductor, which is the hot, because it is not connected to the ground. So it is confusing, because we have a ground wire and we have a grounded conductor. In England, they don't use the word ground for their they use earthing. So the earthing system would be the bare copper wire, but then they might have a grounded conductor. So
So you're just saying that the grounded conductor is a neutral.
yes, in
Okay.
an AC system. And in a DC system, it's usually in America, the negative wire is the grounded conductor.
Correct. All right. Now I have another question.
Okay, well, let me
Might be a-
finish this thought
Go ahead.
here and why that's important is because in the old days, the neutral had to be white or gray because it was the grounded conductor. But now, because it's no longer physically or solidly grounded in the service panel or wherever it's grounded to, or in the inverter, it's now, because the NEC says ungrounded conductors are red, black, or any other color. So now the negative, we recommend you keep that black and you keep the positive as red. But as far as the NEC is concerned, they're the same kind of conductor. They're no longer, they're both ungrounded conductors.
Okay.
Okay, I fear I've confused everybody on that. And
No,
it's
no,
a
well, let me-
relatively minor point.
Okay. So I have another question. So your grounding anode outside the 8-foot rod connects to the ground in the circuit breaker panel.
Yes.
Why do you have to have another ground when your inlet copper water pipe? Because now you have two grounds.
My inlet water copper pipe.
Suppose I have
Oh.
a copper pipe that comes from the utility, which brings the water into the house,
Right.
but it's also grounded to the circuit breaker panel.
Oh, yours is?
Yeah.
Probably because in the olden days, they used to allow you to connect a ground to the water pipes. And you don't want to have two different sources of ground because you can get what's referred to as a ground loop. There
Right.
can be a slightly different level of potential at each of those grounds. So you want to bond those grounds together in order to make sure that they're at a level
The
of
same
potential.
potential.
So just in case something has been connected inside your house to that, that's one explanation. The other explanation might be that in your jurisdiction, a single grounding electrode may not be considered sufficient for
Okay.
your soil. And so now they're taking your copper pipe as a second ground and
Okay.
bonding them together, where you could have gotten by simply pounding in several ground rods and bonding them together.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
I had a question on one of the questions.
Okay.
So in one of the questions, it talked about you have the inverter, then you have the AC disconnect, and then you have the panel.
Okay.
And the wire from the inverter to the AC disconnect, and then the wire from the AC disconnect to the panel.
To the
Is the
service
wire
panel?
from- Yes, to the service panel.
Okay.
And it said, is the wire from the inverter to the AC disconnect load or line? And
Oh,
then
yeah,
the
yeah,
AC
yeah.
disconnect to the panel, is that load or line? Now, in my mind, because electricity is coming from the inverter, that would be a line. And then from the AC disconnect to the panel, I would think would be a load, but it's the opposite way. And so it's confusing me.
It is. And in fact, I've seen a number of discussion forums in electrical contractors talk about this, and it's a point of confusion. The reason why it's easy to remember that the inverter is always the load. That's just one way to remember it.
Okay.
Because you'll have a DC disconnect on the side between the panels and the inverter. Well, that's a little more straightforward, right? What is the line? Well, the line is the panels, right? They're the things generating electricity. Are you with me there?
Yep.
And then the load is the inverter because that's what's receiving the electricity.
Mhm.
And the reason we have a line side and a load side on our disconnects is that when you turn it off, you want most of that disconnect to, as much of it as possible, to be de-energized. So only the connection points at the top are going to be energized, while all the other parts, the blade, the rest of the box is now completely de-energized. Well, then when you get on the inverter side of the, of towards the service panel, it gets a little more confusing because clearly there's power coming from the array through the inverter, but there's also the potential of power coming from the grid. You know, electricity flows in omnidirections. So what happens when you turn off the AC disconnect?
Well, the panel is connected to the top of the AC disconnect, so it's going to disconnect the panel, and all the guts of the inverter coming into the AC disconnect is still going to be powered by the AC disconnect, right?
Yeah, but as soon as the inverter loses signal from the grid, what does it do?
Shuts off.
Right. So there will be no hot wire. It'll be dead, right? Just like a load would be dead if you disconnect it. So then the only live component under that scenario is the line coming in from the grid because the inverter is shut off, which is
Okay.
the whole purpose of setting up your line and load in a disconnect, is you only want those two little input, terminals to be hot.
Okay, so in practical matters, what you said at the beginning, the inverter is always a load. And so when you take lines from the inverter into the AC disconnect, it goes into basically the bottom. And then the line is coming from the service panel, which comes into the top.
Correct.
And then on the other side, on the DC disconnect, the line is coming from the array. So in the DC disconnect, it goes in the top.
Right.
And when it goes to the inverter, it comes out the bottom, and all the guts that are down there goes over to the inverter.
Right.
So your DC connect, I'm just looking in my mind at the direction of the wires and if they're coming in the top or bottom and who's getting shut off first when you pull those handles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And so you're right. And the inverter is just always the load, because if you start overthinking it, it can get you all tied into knots. But it really is because as soon as you disconnect, the inverter shuts down. So it will not be generating any power. So it functions like a load even on the AC side.
I have a question on the smart inverters.
Sure.
Do the smart inverters have to have internet? And like, does UL 1741-SA require that you have your inverters connected to the internet, basically, so you can do whatever?
No, all of that is handled through data over power. As far as the smart functionality, typically though, the smart inverters do have internet, but that's more for production and load monitoring. So, to keep track of what's being output. But as far as what it's doing with the utility, that is not based on the internet. That's simply data coming over the power lines.
Okay.
Yeah, and what the smart inverter is specifically there to address, and this happened a number of times in California. Let's say you've got 100,000 homes all hooked up to inverters with solar panels, and the grid goes down. Well, all of those solar panels, all those systems go down. Well, typically when there's a power outage, before there was distributed energy, the utility knew how much power was being consumed when the power went off and could anticipate what that would be when they started things back up. So they made sure they had enough power to make it work. But with solar, a lot of the consumptions may be hidden. So that's one issue there where they might have to over generate. If they miss it, they may get a secondary crash. But then what would happen is, let's say they get it all right. All of these 100,000 systems come back online with the grid, and all of their functionality all of the loads are being serviced by the grid, because there's a 5-minute period when it takes for the inverters to all do their handshake process before they'll turn back on. So if every single one of those inverters is set for exactly 5 minutes, no more, no less, in 5 minutes, suddenly every single inverter kicks on. The load that's required of the grid plummets, because now it's being taken over by these solar production, and the voltage skyrockets, because it's like, turning off everything, it's all in balance, which then kicks that voltage out of the plus or minus 6% range that the utility is designed to function at, and it crashes again. So then you go through the routine all over again. So you were getting these cascading crashes. So now the smart inverter says, all right, you're not going to turn on in 5 minutes. You're going to turn on when the grid is at a point that it can accept you. That might be 5 minutes. It might be 10 minutes. It depends. It depends on how many people are doing their handshake. But you're going to be smart enough to know you've got to match whatever voltage is coming on, that's available, so you don't overproduce or draw down that voltage. So that's one of the issues, but there are other things involved, like frequency cleanup and stuff like that, because what they were concerned about there is if the frequency varies, if the voltage varies, they used to have very strict parameters. Now they're saying, let's have a little more leeway, because we want these things to stay on if possible. So let's give ourselves a little more flexibility. Be smart enough to look at the grid and anticipate, is this truly a power outage, or is it just a brown, a dip or a surge that you can get through? So.
Hey, Jay, how do the inverters handle a brownout? When you say brownout,
typically now the smart inverters are smart enough to realize, oh, it's just a small brownout. We'll adjust accordingly. They should be able to weather through that, within a certain range. The utility has always dealt with plus or minus, and, they've got to match whatever's on the utility. So they've got to adjust their output if they're pushing power out to the grid. So the brownout is typically a drop in voltage. Mm-hmm. So, and so if it drops to, instead of 240, it's down to 230, your inverter should be able to deal with that.
Okay.
And it might even augment some of the voltage. I don't know, so that your appliances don't suffer that same brownout. These things are getting pretty clever. So the other thing about the smart inverters is not every jurisdiction requires it. So, check with your local utility. If you're buying a new inverter, not a problem. All of the new inverters are going to be UL 1741 SA, which is the smart inverter standard. So they've been tested to that. But where it comes into play is, like, I bought some remaindered inverters from a distributor, and I got a super good price on them. They were microinverters. And instead of costing $149, I got them for $29 a piece. But it's because they weren't smart inverters. And a lot of the jurisdictions require it, but my jurisdiction didn't require it. And so why not? They still work. It's like getting an iPhone 6 instead of an iPhone 8 or whatever. Okay, so it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it still makes phone calls. It still does what it's supposed to do. So, all right. Any other questions? Paul, you're our go-to for questions here. Yeah, Jay hasn't even read the book, so we got to rely on Paul.
I did have a question on the practical side again. I've noticed I've got a solar panel that I'm using to run a pump periodically during the day for watering these hydroponic systems. Uh-huh. And in the morning, I see a lot of dew on that panel, and I'm wondering, what is the effect of dew on the efficiency of those panels? Is it like, you know, shading? Is it, what is it? What does it do?
I would think, well, first off, they are typically waterproof, so it's not going to cause any problem from that regard. Two things, cooling it is helpful. So as it evaporates, it may help it produce power. But, and you may even get a little bit of a concentrator effect sometimes, depending on the angle of the sun. But usually with the dew will come some residual dirt and the like that stays on the panel. So the effect's probably negligible overall. It's not causing you any problem, but it may leave a little, no more than the dust and the dirt that you would get on the panel. It wouldn't hurt to wipe them off, but not going to be that much of a difference.
Right. The other thing that I noticed is there was a discussion on whether or not sun tracking, there was a video that you had on sun tracking, whether or not it was useful or not.
Yeah.
And she basically said it's not useful, it's not worth your money to do sun tracking. So in that situation, we just want to point ours to solar south. Is that?
Yeah. Typically, especially with a ground mounted system. Now with a roof mounted system, you're probably limited based on the orientation of the building. But yeah, solar south is almost always going to be your best bet. Although you will find in some locations, 180 degrees might not be ideal. It might be 179, 182, slight variations like that. But generally solar south is the ideal, and the angle of incident or the altitude is going to vary. It's going to vary depending on your latitude, and it will vary depending on where you're located in the time zone. So, I've found here that anywhere between 25 degrees and 35 degrees is pretty close to ideal. Within 1% of production of each other, and 180 is the best. Remembering that magnetic south and solar south are not the same thing. And also remembering that if you're in the southern hemisphere, it's all backwards. Then you want to face them north. So.
Do you find yourself adjusting your panels during the winter and summer months on your altitude?
No, you can if you've got a very small system. But I think what you'll find, at least it's true for me and most people that I've talked to who have solar, is you get kind of lazy about it, kind of blasé. If you're worried about the amount of production, throw a few more panels on your system, as opposed to worrying too much about going out there and making that adjustment. I have seen some systems, like we used to teach classes over at Slippery Rock University, and they had a nice little solar array in the backyard of the building we taught. And it had about, 12 panels or something. And the class would go out and make a manual adjustment when we'd go there. And it was just basically pull a pin, push the whole thing up, stick the pin in the next level. You can do that. Although we've often found whenever we do something like that, you end up disturbing some, wasp nest or something, and you get stung, and it's better just to leave it alone. So, that's something to consider too. I've even gotten lazy about cleaning snow off the solar panels in the wintertime. Used to be, I had this long trucker squeegee thing that I could go out there and clean off the snow. And I was religious about it because, by God, I'm going to get every kilowatt I can get produced. Now it's kind of like, yeah, if I wait a day, it'll melt. It's like, it's fine. If it's not melting, it's probably because there's no sun and not going to get any power anyway. So, but that's kind of up to you.
What about the battery packs for backup? Do you find those useful?
Battery packs like in a,
No, just the battery banks
yeah, for an AC coupled or a DC coupled or for a standalone system?
for a AC coupled.
Yeah, that's a matter of how reliable is your grid. You know, if you've got an unreliable grid, then yeah, it could be critical. My grid where I live is pretty reliable. We've had about 2 power outages in the last 15 years. So a battery bank is not that important, but I'd still like to have one because we've seen the world to be a fairly unstable place, and it would be nice to have that kind of security. But it hasn't been enough of a priority for me to invest in that. Another thing is just how critical are the loads. You know, if you have like an egg hatchery or something, or you're talking about aquaponics, and if you have a cold snap with no electricity and everything dies, well, then it may be much more critical than just being a little bit cold. So, you know, that's going to be up to you. All right. Any other questions from anybody? We're approaching the hour here. All right. So I'll be sending out another notice to everybody with, you know, here's the address, here's when I want you to be there, that kind of thing. Once we're there in person on Saturday, you know, we'll be good. Everybody will be clear as to where we are, what we're doing. I would encourage you, if you can spend the weekend, you know, doing the labs on Saturday and the test and review on Sunday. I have had a couple of people in the class who have indicated they're going to be so pressed for time, they can only be away like one day. Be there on Saturday to do the hands-on, because you can do the exam remotely if need be. They do have an online, it's called Exam Room AI, where you can do you know, from any laptop, any testing center, you can take the test online. So, and if you don't pass the first day, that's an option as well. You know, we come through, you take it, and then later you say, you know what, how about I wait a month, I review everything, and then you can sign up with ETA to take it remotely from your own laptop. There is like a $14 fee, I think, associated with doing that, but that's cheaper than flying back into Ohio to have me stand over you while you do a paper thing. So I don't know.
Cheaper than a hotel also.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we have, I was talking to, I don't think it's you, Paul, but somebody's coming in from Arizona to do this. So, and somebody was coming in from Missouri. I think, Ed, you're in Ohio, aren't you? And
No, I'm outside of Philly.
oh, yeah, you're
Pennsylvania.
right. Yeah, you're in Pennsylvania. And Jay, you're in Indiana. Is that right? You're Illinois?
I'm also Pennsylvania. I'm near Ed.
Okay. All right. Yep. So yeah. Yeah. Well, if you're coming all that way for one day, you may as well make it 2. So
That's right.
plus it's a vacation. You get to see all the sites.
Oh yeah, that destination of Dayton. Woo.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yep. All right. Okay. Well, if you have any questions, you've got my email, you've got my phone. So give me a shout. But other than that, I'll see you guys on Saturday. All right.
All righty.
Okay, we'll see you
Take care.
then.
Bye-bye.
All right,
Yeah.
bye-bye.